Today's talk is titled Sex, Gender, and UU, to be delivered by the Reverend Lynn Hopkins. Reverend Lynn Hopkins is a Unitarian Universalist minister serving the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Montgomery, Alabama. Lynn is a lifelong activist for justice and equity since the days of the Vietnam War. Raised in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., Lynn and Lynn's spouse, Carolyn, lived for 20 years in the Atlanta area and then in Denver, Colorado, briefly before settling in Montgomery in 2014. In all of those places, Lynn was engaged in public advocacy, protest, testimony, and other activities in areas of sexuality and gender equity, racial equity, poverty and homelessness, criminal justice, disability, access, and more. Currently, Lynn serves as co-chair of Interfaith Montgomery on the board of Montgomery Pride United and the Leadership Council of Faith in Action, Alabama, and is a member of Trust, Transgender Religious Professional UUs Together. Lynn identifies as queer and non-binary and prefers the use of Lynn's first name in place of pronouns. Please welcome the Reverend Lynn Hopkins.
Good morning. It is a joy and a great honor to be with you this morning. I have taken up this topic a number of times in my career, and usually I begin with the question, who can tell me the difference between a boy and a girl? Of course, that's before I had the luxury of that fabulous reading from the biology professor who laid it out in enormous and intricate detail. When I first saw that reading, I posted it online with the comment, unfortunately, it's not this simple. Nothing, no matter how complicated and intricate we try to illustrate, is ever as simple as we think. So, as I took up the topic this time, inspired by a conversation with a friend of mine who is a Southern Baptist minister in Montgomery, Alabama, a friend of mine who is loving and inclusive in every way that he can manage, and continues to grow in curiosity and humility, but recently said to me, you know, I can understand the gay thing, but the T, this trans, I just don't get that. So I set about to find a way that I could make it intelligible. And in the process, well, in the midst of that process, this nation elected a new president that changed everything. And it became necessary for me to imagine a way to make this intelligible to a wider audience of allies and those who would be foes. Did you know that by executive order, we now have our first non-binary president? I love that executive order that was issued on the first day of his presidency that said that sex is binary and immutably determined by the sex of the embryo at the time of conception. Of course, the trouble with that, I don't have any graduate study in biology, but I did get enough in high school to understand that for the 6 weeks of development, embryos are non-binary. If nothing interrupts the process, they will all grow up to be female. In roughly half of the embryos, there is an intervention, a chemical intervention in processing that leaves us with male. But really, our president has decided and made it law that everyone is categorized by one of two binary choices that is immutably determined by the sex of the embryo at the time of conception. You heard Dr. Helm's lengthy, complicated, messy description of various differences in sex development. Differences in sex development is the common term, sometimes abbreviated DSD, that most folks know as intersex. Once in a while, a child gets an extra chromosome from a parent, or a chromosome is absent, or there are irregular hormonal levels, or there are any number of variations. I think most of us know this can happen. What many of us don't realize is that it actually happens in about 1.7 of births, 1.7% of births. That's consistent over time. 1.7% means that there are roughly the same number of intersex persons in the US as there are religious Jews. About the same number as there are with verified peanut allergies. About half again as there are Muslims. That many people don't fit into the two categories that our current administration claims includes all human beings. Many human beings just aren't exactly human beings under law. Of course, this isn't the first time that our nation has placed some large number of persons outside of the status of person. I live in Alabama. You know, we fought a war over that, and most of us thought the war was over. It isn't. Now, it's very important to note that intersex is an entirely different thing from transgender. As the professor mentions in the reading, many people with sex differences in development are unaware and may remain unaware for their entire life. These folks may comfortably identify with one or the other of the binary sex categories. In fact, it continues to frustrate researchers, medical and social theorists, that there is no apparent correlation between transgender experience and differences in sex development. I think it's reasonable to assume, based on what we know, that differences in sex development or intersex have existed for as long as human beings have existed. Because we know that, yes, environmental exposures can sometimes lead to chromosomal irregularities, but for differences in sex development, scientific evidence indicates that in virtually every instance, these are randomly occurring. And I say virtually every only because lived experience has taught me that always is always false. It is difficult to establish anything as fact with regard to the chromosomal history of human beings. It's much easier, though, to establish that certain lived experiences have existed throughout history, notwithstanding a concerted and highly effective effort over time to write the transgender experience out of ancient religious texts. You may not know, I didn't, that historical evidence speaks to a Roman emperor in the 3rd century, the time when much of Christian scripture was being recorded, who actively sought medical assistance in modifying their genitalia. There are researchers who are confident they can point to brain characteristics that represent gender identity, and that there are areas of gray matter identical among people who identify as one or the other of binary choices, regardless of biological sex characteristics. I don't know enough brain science to evaluate that evidence. I can tell you it comes from reputable scientists in reputable institutions. It just isn't yet clearly defined enough to make a particular claim that will hold up. So I just don't know, and I really don't care. Because what I do know from lived experience and human interaction is that most people feel male or female. The clarity and the intensity of that feeling is the same, whether that person's feeling correlates with their biological sex characteristics or not. That is to say, whether they are cisgender or transgender. There is such a thing as gender identity. It's not chosen. It's not chosen, and it's not subject to change by external influence. You can't talk or treat or pray someone out of transgender experience. God knows we've tried. So with the possible exception of evidence emerging from brain science, there isn't any physical characteristic of transgender experience. It is an internal experience of consciousness. Sure, I've known trans women who appeared much more feminine than the general male population, but I've also known trans women with the size and shape as male appearing as any NFL defensive lineman. So while researchers may eventually identify aspects of our brain that designate male or female identity, there is certainly no visible anatomical aspect. Trans is an experience. There are also those who have never identified comfortably with either binary option. The notion of binary gender, of identifying with one or the other, male or female, just never made sense to me. I don't get it. It's not that I reject it. It's fine if that's who you are. I recognize that it is real and meaningful for the vast majority of human beings, including when I married. But even as a young child, I realized I couldn't understand what people meant when they talked about gender. It's as though everyone else knew something I didn't. They didn't learn it. It's not in books. It wasn't taught to them. They just knew it in the same way they knew how to see with their eyes and hear with their ears. It was built in. But somehow I was left out. I was in my 40s before I knew it wasn't just me. And there was a word for it. That non-binary is actually a thing. But according to federal law, not anymore. By executive order, information about what our 47th president calls gender ideology was removed from government websites. The term gender was replaced by sex. The Bureau of Prisons stopped reporting the number of transgender incarcerated people The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention removed the lessons on building supportive school environments. The problem for them is that executive orders can't make us go away. History should have taught us by now that defining human in a way that leaves some people out just doesn't work. That's the problem for them. The problem for us is manifold. People who do not conform to their definition of human can be subjected to a wide array of violence. Already, trans women are being moved to all-male prisons. Already, passports and other forms of ID are being issued or renewed in a way that contradicts not just someone's identity or experience of themselves, but contradicts also their physical appearance and even their genitalia. I know a UU minister who's not sure she'll ever be able to travel out of the country anymore because her passport was updated to match her original birth certificate, which said male. Already, information about the lived reality of about 2% of Americans has been removed from websites of National Institutes of Health, Center for Disease Control, and a number of state university systems. Already, just calling a student by their name or allowing a student to speak openly about their struggles has been criminalized in some jurisdictions. But there is good news. Honest, there is. Even as much as it feels like the arc of the universe is straightening itself out right now, moving in the opposite direction from justice. That's only what the reactionary forces would have you believe. Most people today actually know better. They know better. They cannot be told that their family members, their friends, their neighbors, their co-workers are something other than fully human. This will not stand. I've never been more sure of anything. Now, it will progress. That is to say, get worse, perhaps much worse. And yes, people, especially young people, will die as a direct result. But it will not stand, provided, of course, that we as Unitarian Universalists join with our allies to actively, deliberately, vociferously tear it down. We cannot rest. Just as corrupt religious structures have been used as a tool or a weapon to advance hatred and division, true, authentic religion, religion that welcomes the questions and conscientiously seeks truth, is a powerful tool of resistance. Unitarian Universalism is peculiar in its understanding of God, that God might be a named, extant, conscious human being, or maybe a force of nature, or maybe something else. For me, when I use the word, I'm not thinking of a real person or a consciousness. For me, love is not an attribute of God, but a synonym. God is love, and it's real. Love, not like a warm feeling, not like I care what happens to you, but love like the actions of those who refuse to allow violence and suffering to persist unchecked. Love that says, maybe I like you, or maybe I can't stand you. And maybe most of the time we work at cross purposes, but I recognize and embrace your humanness. And because of our shared humanness, I will do all that I can to ensure your safety and well-being. love. We will speak up. We will speak truth even when it feels unwelcome or unsafe. And we will seek truth even when it feels like we already know all we need to know. I want to recognize, too, this is a time of great opportunity for us as Unitarian Universalists, a time that our movement becomes embodied, visible, alive in a new way. You know, there are folks out there who encountered Unitarian Universalism when we showed up in force at the Voting Rights March in Selma 60 years ago, and they have no idea we still exist. Those folks, their children, their grandchildren need us now. The nation and the world need us now. And maybe, just maybe, we need this moment to re-energize and refocus and enliven us. Now, I don't know what comes next, but I do know that you, each of you, no matter your place or activity in life, every one of us has a part to play in these days. I also know love changes lives, not just individual lives, not just the lives of families. Love can and must impact the life of this nation. It falls to each of us to rise and move and engage with love, tirelessly, with humility and curiosity and grace. Each of us touches and changes the lives of others, more often than not, by far, in ways we do not know and with people we do not remember. We are called this day to live into Unitarian Universalism as never before. And so we move forward. May it be ever so and more so with each passing day.